They like to make a return and like to move on. They don't usually stay long term. So when you do business with an institution, you have to be prepared for that institution to tell you in 3 to 5 or 7 years that they want their money. They want you to sell your property and they want their money. So Gary worked with this broker that I told you about that we drove around with for 9 months. He was a very, very good broker. Gary engaged that broker to try to find a buyer for the Penmore Shopping Center so that he could pay ING their profit and he could keep the management of the property. And he also had an ownership position because that was what he negotiated with his financial partner. So he attempted to put a package together, circulate it into the community, and try to find someone to buy out ING. And this was back in, now, chronologically, I would say around 2001. I don't know if you all remember what the economy was like in 2001, but it was the dot-com bubble, and people were very reluctant to invest money because the money that they thought they had when the stock market went up and then the stock market went down, they didn't have all that money. They were very, very reluctant to invest. And I had said earlier about the Woodmont Corner transaction and the fact that the proceeds from the sale of Woodmont Corner were not enough to be able to buy Bull Run, and that I went to my brother, family, and friends to try to help raise money because the capital source is a very important aspect of a real estate transaction. So in this case, Gary went to me and he said, "Sam, would you be my partner in Penmore?" And Penmore really didn't fit my model. It wasn't the type of center that I would have typically bought or the type of location that I would have typically bought. But we were able to agree upon terms, and I was able to make an investment with him. And I got a very nice return on my investment, and I was very happy. Things were good. We refinanced the property. I was able to get my original investment completely out. I was able to get cash flow. So while this wasn't something that I had intended to do or I had interest in doing, it turned out to be a good opportunity for me. So things changed. Mr. Rappaport decided he wanted to get his equity out because he had other uses for the money. And he was very interested in trying to get me to buy a larger percentage of his interest in the property. And I asked Mark Roth to help me evaluate the opportunity. And even though someone may be your friend, their opinion of value and your opinion of value might not be the same. And Mark was able to say, "Sam, I think that there really isn't the value here that you otherwise might get." And I told Gary, I said, "Gary, well, I know you'd like to sell more of your interest and stay in and continue to manage the property and lease it. I'm not interested in doing that." So finally, the chief financial officer of Mr. Rappaport's company, when we were sitting in a meeting and things were getting heated, he said, "Why don't you two just sell the property?" Well, Gary didn't want to sell the whole property. He'd lose the management fees, he'd lose the leasing fees. I didn't really want to sell the property because I'd have to give up my cash flow. Trying to find properties that are income producing and stable are very, very difficult to do. It's not easy. And when you get one and it's performing, you're not so quick to dispose of it. But I wanted to try to be sensitive to my partner, and I said to him, "Okay, we'll sell the property." So was I a little bit of a nice guy? Yeah. But I've known him a long time. His company oversees my portfolio of shopping centers. I trust him, I respect him, I like him. And so what happened? I needed to attempt to find an opportunity to reinvest the money from my interest in Penmore. Now, because we were partners, and he was going to take his money and do something else with it, this became a much, much, much more complicated transaction. And initially, I didn't know whether or not I would be able to defer the tax on the gain of what I paid for my interest in this property and what I was going to get when the property was sold. And that's where these two gentlemen spent hours and hours and hours, and they're going to tell you about it, structuring a transaction that allowed me to take the value of my interest in Penmar and to trade it into a property that's called Rock Creek Village. This is a Safeway anchored center. It's 100,000 square feet, much smaller than 387,000 that was Penmar. And I was able to take the proceeds from the sale of Penmar and acquire a new shopping center that I owned 100% myself. All right, and without getting into too much detail, my original investment in Penmar was $1.5 million. And I got 50% of the deal for $1.5 million. Now remember, the economy in 2001 wasn't great, and it wasn't easy for Mr. Rappaport to find a financial partner, so he wanted to hold on for dear life, and he made me an attractive deal. That money, that investment in Penmar ultimately grew to enable me to take my pro rata share of the proceeds and buy a center. And today, if it's not number one, it's very high on the totem pole. Grocery-anchored neighborhood centers are the preferred investment for financial institutions in the Washington metropolitan area. Why? Because they're stable. People have to eat. People go to the drugstore. People get their hair cut. People put gas in their cars at the gas station. Very, very competitive product type. Very, very difficult properties to acquire. Let me tell you a little bit more about Rock Creek, and then I'm going to ask Steve and Mark again to explain to you what they did to allow me to transfer my ownership interest in Penmar into Rock Creek, not pay any tax. So I had the advantage of being able to reinvest the proceeds that would have been paid in tax and allow me to have another center to replace the income stream from Penmar that had been so stable and I'd appreciated so much. All right, we're going to stop right here for a minute. I'm going to turn it back over to Steve and Mark. Any questions on this property so far? Anything at all? Okay. Gentlemen?
I mentioned the last transaction, the stars came into alignment, and they did on this one also. Rock Creek Village, Sam had we had looked at this and analyzed it 2 other times that it kept coming up for sale. And part of the issue with the previously looking at it was that the sellers were asking for somewhat of a premium on the property. When this came up where we were going to try to defer the gain, and when we looked at the tax savings and being able to defer the gain, then this one looked a little bit more attractive as far as a purchase price. We couldn't do a traditional like-kind exchange on this. And going back to some of the rules that are in the outline, you can't exchange partnership interests. So we had a situation where one partner wanted to cash out and leave, the other partner wanted to exchange into another property. And as Steve mentioned, the Penmar partnership sold the property, so the Penmar partnership had to buy the replacement property under a traditional like-kind exchange. And that was not feasible because the partnership would have to reinvest all of the proceeds, and Sam only owns 40% of the time. So it's was quite an onerous capital commitment to try to do a traditional like-kind exchange. The other thing that could have been done, but we did not have time, was we could have taken Penmar, that could have gone and divided Penmar into tenants in common interest, so that Gary owned his half and Sam owned his half, and then they would have sold, Sam would have exchanged, and Gary would have cashed out. There wasn't enough time to do this because the decision to sell Penmar occurred around December of last year. The decision was Penmar was going to go on the market January, end of January, beginning of February. Rock Creek came up, so Rock Creek was available, and the purchase was going to have to be, the purchase commitment was going to have to be made by about the same time. And there was not enough time to get lender approval to make it, for tax reasons, to make it look really legitimate, that from December to, say, the time Penmar went on the market, that they actually were able to go through and convert the ownership to tenants in common interest. So we had to do another type of transaction in order to come up with a deferral for Sam, and the other partner cashed out. The other thing that's in the outline is like-kind property means like-kind property. So you can't trade a fee interest for a partnership interest. You can't trade partnership interest. You can't trade marketable securities. You have to trade real estate for real estate or equipment for equipment. I think when you trade in a car, that's basically, that's a like-kind exchange for the dumbest thing. When everyone in the room probably has participated in. You're trading in the old car, you're getting the new car. So there just wasn't enough time, the one property was ready to go on the market, the second one was ready to be purchased, and there was not enough time to do it like that. So that's the, I'll let Steve take over.
This was really an interesting transaction, and it was really complicated. And sometimes you don't know how complicated they're going to be until you just kind of get into it, because it doesn't seem like it should be that hard. But again, remembering all the components, you've got one partner who wants to sell, the other one who doesn't want to sell. And then that really is when you're, as a real estate professional, and I'm dealing in my law practice, in like-kind exchanges, the issue we're most often dealing with is not how do you exchange one property for another, but how do you deal with the real-life issues of having multiple owners with different objectives. And that's where really the complicated planning comes up. So here we were in a situation, as Mark said, where we couldn't get the entity to exchange for the other property. You couldn't have that, because then what do you do with the one partner who wants to liquidate and get their money? So what we ended up doing is looked at ways where we could have the existing partner, well actually looking at ways to achieve a tax advantage transaction without using section 1031 of the Internal Revenue Code. There are other provisions that allow transfers without the imposition of tax. One of them is a liquidating distribution. So where you've got an entity that distributes ownership interests to members in exchange for their interest of the entity, depending on how you do it, often that can be done on a tax-free basis. And that's what we ended up doing here. And what we did was we had identified that we wanted to buy Rock Creek. So we realized that one thing, we started kind of figuring out, saying, okay, well, what if Penmar bought the Rock Creek Shopping Center, and then at that point they owned both of them, and then liquidated that shopping center to Sam Lehrman in complete liquidation of his ownership interest in the property. So Sam ended up with, actually we were going to do it the other way, weren't we, initially? We were going to have Sam keep Rock Creek, keep Penmar, and distribute out, we were going to we were going to buy, it's so confusing. Initially what we were going to do is we were going to buy from the existing old entity, we were going to buy the new shopping center. And then Sam was going to end up with that entity, and we were going to sell and liquidate out to Gary Rappaport the interest, and he was going to end up with the cash from the sale of one entity, and Sam would have the new entity. What we ended up doing was the opposite, because we had some lender issues, and what we did is we had Rock Creek buy, we had Penmar buy Rock Creek. Sam arranged to finance it because we needed the money to buy it. So we created a new entity that loaned the money in so that there would be enough money in Penmar to buy Rock Creek. So at this one period of time, now we owned both of these shopping centers. And this you were able to do because you had a relationship with the other party. And ultimately what we did is from there, on the eve of the sale of Penmar, we liquidated Rock Creek out to Sam on a tax-free basis, so he ended up with the new shopping center. And then Gary sold Penmar and was able to take the gain. He sold it, and there was a deferred amount that we had to pay off. It was subject to this debt because Sam had loaned the money in to buy the exchange property or to buy the replacement property. And then that was paid off. The net result was that we were able to get the sale of one and the purchase of another. It was complicated, but we were able to get there. And the reason why it ended up getting so confusing, and I'm confused now, is that we had so many different ways that we planned it, but every time we tried something, we'd run into an obstacle. And that's kind of the challenge of doing this, because we had one way we were going to do it, but then when we had the liquidation, we were going to be transferring out 100% of the membership interest in an entity. And when you were transferring out 100% of the membership interest in the entity, you were going to have double transfer taxes. So we had to do it the reverse way and examine whether we could do it that way, in a way where, based upon the dollar amounts, we were able to have less than 80%, which was the rule in effect. So we were able to structure it in a way where we didn't have to pay the double transfer taxes. We were able to liquidate it on a tax advantage basis. And then we had to deal with the lender, who was going to allow us to buy the shopping center with one group of owners, and within 90 days, change the ownership structure completely. Because normally, as you know, you'll get involved in a real estate transaction, they'll have due on sale provisions or other triggers where if you want to change the ownership, the lender is going to either want to do on sale, or they're going to want to have an additional assumption fee and other things. So we had to deal with all those different transactions, but really the important thing to take away is that there are more ways to achieve your objective of selling property without paying taxes and simply a 1031 exchange. They can get complicated, but it's important to get to a professional who deals in that area early on in the process, because I'll tell you, in my practice, way too often, people call me for the first time after they say, listen, I just sold this property, and I think it was a good buy, and I did this and this and this. You know, how can I not pay taxes? You know, it's after the fact, and the answer usually is you can't do anything. I think it's important early on to do it, and I apologize if I was completely confusing on the transaction, but I was confused. I knew it before I stood up here. Anybody have any questions that I can do?
Anybody confused?
Should be completely confused.
Okay, thank you, Steve. All right. I want to tell you a little bit of the story about Rock Creek and how I had previously identified it. As Mark said, I had looked at that property previously, and the seller wanted a price that I thought was more than I was willing to pay for it, so I passed. And the seller actually passed away, and his estate owned other grocery-anchored neighborhood properties, and the executor of the estate decided to sell off 3 properties. So it was this property, Rock Creek, 103,000 square feet, and then two other properties, one of which was 300,000 square feet, and another property which was 125,000 square feet. So this was the smallest property. And the seller, the estate, they really wanted to sell these three properties as a package. They wanted to make it a package deal. So they wanted to bundle them together and sell the three of them together. Now, sometimes when you're trying to pry something loose from a package, you have to give the seller an incentive to do that. And I could afford to pay a little more because the Penmar gain was not going to be taxed because of the way we structured the transaction. So I had a few more dollars left over. And I could be competitive. And I was able to persuade the seller of the Rock Creek Village property, who had the other two, to split this one off from the other two. Remember I told you about some of those sleepless nights I had with Woodmont Corner and Outback Steakhouse? I was very concerned that I might not be able to pry this property loose. And if I hadn't been able to do it, and I wasn't able to find a replacement property, despite all the planning, despite all the work, despite these gentlemen's creativity, I would have ended up having to pay the tax on Penmar. So there's a lot of risk to these transactions. There are a lot of moving pieces to the puzzle. You have to try to keep your eye on the picture to make sure that all those pieces in that puzzle are in front of you so you can see them. And I can say to you that the satisfaction that comes from taking all these pieces and making sure you know where they are and then able to have the transaction come to fruition, very, very satisfying. Most of us pay taxes. It's not fun, but it's the country we're in and it's the system we're in. The ability to not pay that tax and reinvest that money that you'd otherwise have to pay helps you grow your business. Now let me get in for a minute. This is the Safeway in the shopping center. And one of the things that I thought was nice about this architecturally are these columns. Circular columns that are on a masonry base. I thought that was nice. This is some of the things I try to do when I buy a shopping center, an existing shopping center. Are there any architectural enhancements that I'm able to make? Because I'm going to own it long term. I'm not going to buy it and then turn around and resell it. I want to keep these properties because it's my business, I want to grow it, and I like the business very much. Landscaping. Is there anything I can do to improve the landscaping? I told you that this property was in an estate, and the executors of the estate didn't have the same passion for operating the properties as the gentleman who unfortunately passed away. The landscaping of this property was not in very good shape, and so there was a tremendous opportunity for me to enhance and upgrade the landscaping. Signage. There's a lot of different ways to advertise your property. The pylon sign that has the name of the shopping center and the grocery store and some of the major tenants. What kind of condition is it in? Has it been upgraded? Has it been renovated? Is it well lit? Is it crisp? Is it visible? In this particular property, the trees had overgrown the pylon so that you almost couldn't see it. Lighting. I want to make sure my properties are very, very well lit. I'm very conscious of the consumer. I want the consumer to feel comfortable when they come to my properties. Daylight savings time is going to change here in a few weeks. It's going to get dark at 5 o'clock. I want to make sure that when the consumer comes to my property, the property is extremely well lit. They feel comfortable, they feel secure, and they want to come and they want to spend their money in my property. Now, I showed you those columns over by Safeway that I thought were nice. So here is what was existing at the property, which is just a brick pier. Not necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing or attractive feature. I decided that it might be a plus to take these circular columns and replace the brick columns with something that's architecturally a little bit more interesting. So we're in the process of doing that. The sidewalk out in front of the retail stores, it was just poured concrete. It was cracked, it was spalled, it was old, it hadn't necessarily been that well maintained. If I use the term exposed aggregate, does that mean anything to you all? Okay, so we are replacing all of the under canopy sidewalks with exposed aggregate. Why are we doing that? I'm trying to make the aesthetic of the property more attractive, more appealing, a place where people feel good about and want to be here. Questions? I haven't gotten a lot of questions from this group. This gentleman asked a great question. You asked a good question. Yes?
One question for you. It seems as though all of the centers that you are focused on are suburban in nature. And I was wondering if you could comment on increased gas prices, increased congestion in the area, and more developers in DC focusing on transit centers, metro nodes, and whether or not you have a concern long-term about the profitability and of those centers going forward.
Okay. So, when I buy a center, I try to do a lot of homework as to the homes that are within a 1, 3, 5, 7, 10-mile radius of the shopping center that I'm interested in acquiring. Most people don't move that often. Once they're in a home and they're in a neighborhood and they have children, they have a family, most people don't move that often. There has been a flight to investing in what's called mixed-use urban retail. There's a marketplace for that. It's a different marketplace. I don't know that the urban retail has as many consumers that are necessarily able to come because they can only have so many apartments that are in an urban area. I find that my particular product type is one that I'm very comfortable with. The homes that surround the centers that I own are there. They're there long term. And in the case of that center that I talked to you about, the one that I liked after 9 months of driving around, and I told the broker that one I saw on the very first day 9 months ago is the one I wanted to buy. Sure you've heard of a company called Pulte Homes? Okay. Pulte Homes decided that they wanted to do a massive development about 1.5 miles from that shopping center. So what did they do? They bought every single-family home, and there were probably 700 or 800 of them that were 1.5 miles from my shopping center. And they persuaded Fairfax County to allow them to increase the density and create some garden apartments so they could have more units. If you're careful about the dartboard and you throw the dart and you hit the bullseye, something that's well located, in my opinion, over time, it will get better. Because the family that moves is going to be replaced by another family that's coming in, the schools, all of the various attributes to the neighborhood. It's something that I look at very, very carefully. And there is no right or wrong or good or bad. It's a question of what appeals to you, what do you like, what do you think you're good at. And these properties are very, very stable. They're very consistent. I make an effort to invest in the community where I own my properties. We adopt a local school. Usually it's an elementary school. And we will do field trips where the students, the children from the elementary school will come to the shopping center. And we'll take them through a Giant. We'll take them through a Shoppers Food Warehouse. We'll take them in the back of Starbucks and they'll find out how coffee gets ground. We'll educate these children. I reach out and engage the community where my properties are located, and I try to be a good corporate citizen as well as a capitalist. So I like what I do. I'm enthusiastic about it. I enjoy it. My properties are important to me. That curb appeal that I've mentioned 2 or 3 times, again, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. Your property looks good. The customers like to shop there. The lenders are attracted because now they want to lend you money because your property's in such good shape. The insurance companies are comfortable because you maintain your property so your premiums don't get to be a lot higher. again, it gets back to reputation. Do what you do well. And most importantly, if you can develop the passion for what you're doing, you'll have that extra bit of energy and enthusiasm to do it as well or better than your competitors. Okay.
I want to put somebody on the spot here, if I can, sort of generate a couple of comments. Jody, you're working on a Walmart here in town. Can you tell Mr. Lehrman about the project and see what kind of feedback he might give you?
Sure. Hi. Thank you for being here with us. I work for JBG Rosenfeld, and I'm doing my thesis topic on the First and H Street Walmart that's being built. So, to your comment about the urban markets, can you speak a little bit more about what you mean when you say that the urban markets can't pull as many people to those grocery anchored centers?
Well, when I say they can't pull as many people, let me maybe either rephrase or give you a little different point of view.
Okay.
So, urban retail is a different product. It's a different type of use. So the Walmart that you're working on is going to, I believe, sell groceries, and they're going to sell many different things.
General merchandise as well.
Correct. Is there a gas station there?
No, it's going to be 10,000 square feet of inline retail.
Okay. Is there a bank there?
Hopefully.
Hopefully, okay. Well, that would be good. I guess my point is that, and to your question, sir, the grocery-anchored neighborhood retail affords a choice of tenants to the consumer. Whereas the urban retail, there's a grocery store, there's a Walmart. I'm not being critical, and I'm not saying that's not a good investment. It depends on what the cost is to do it. Depends on the rent that Walmart will pay. It depends. There's a clause in retail called percentage rent, where a tenant will pay you a base rent, and then based upon their sales, if they achieve high sales and you are able to negotiate with them and get them to agree to pay a percentage above a certain number to you as the landlord. So there's lots of different ways to do what you're talking about too. It's just not been something that I've focused on or that I feel comfortable with or I feel is my cup of tea. It's not to say that it can't be profitable, and it's not to say that there aren't opportunities for that.
Sarah, you're working on urban retail. Why don't you describe what you're working on, and maybe we'll get a reaction from Mr. Lehrman.
Perhaps. My capstone is a case study on the O Street Market, which is to become City Market at O, which houses a giant. And so it's a development that's been over 10 years in the process, and looking at all of the complex issues that have gone into the site, and analyzing them and pulling them apart, ultimately answering the question, has it been worth the wait from the developer's perspective?
Very good question. I don't know if any of you all are familiar with the giant that's located at Wisconsin and Newark. It's up Wisconsin Avenue. It's just past the National Cathedral. So if you're going up Wisconsin, Cathedral's on the right. A little bit further up, there's Cactus Cantina, which does gangbuster numbers. Can't get in there, can't make a reservation. The line's always out the door, so if you go there, you got to wait. And the giant family, for lack of a better word, went from my grandfather and Mr. Cohen to a partnership that was composed of an English company called Sainsbury's. They were actually grocers in England. They acquired my family's interest in 1994. So it was the Cohens and Sainsbury. Then Mr. Cohen passed away. And he really hadn't put into place a succession plan. So now Sainsbury's there. They would like to take over the whole thing. They can't take it over. So their investment is not necessarily moving in the direction they wanted to move in. So what happens? A Dutch company named Ahold comes and buys the entirety of Giant Food. So Giant Food went from a private company when my grandfather and Mr. Cohen started it to a public company that had shares on the American Stock Exchange, to a public company that had a family and an institutional owner, the Sainsbury people, to now a private company that is controlled by this Dutch company, Ahold. I don't know if any of you have ever done any business with people that are Dutch. They're very, very, very challenging people to do business with. They're tough as nails. The giant people, the Ahold people, and you know exactly what I'm talking about, they still, after I don't know how many years it's been, they have not been able to get the approvals to take that small giant at Wisconsin and Newark, just past the National Cathedral, and get permission to make it like the social Safeway that's near here, which is a great opportunity for people that live in Georgetown or near Georgetown. That Safeway is fantastic. Giant isn't able to get out of its own way to do that. They're hard-headed. They have their own idea about how things should be done. They're not necessarily responsive to the neighbors or the community. And I just call it like I see it, because I have to deal with them. I'm now Giant's landlord. A number of my properties have Giant food grocery stores in them. And Ahold has tried to run over me more than once. When they changed the signage, the new logo with, I don't know if it's an orange or whatever it is they've got to make it look different, and the old G that was more institutional went away, they just tried to slap up plywood over top of my signs in my shopping centers and say, yep, that's what we're going to do. Because they own a lot of their own properties in New England. So when it's your own property, you can do whatever you want. They wanted to redo the entrance to that first shopping center that I said I bought after the 9 months because they wanted to get better traffic flow. So again, I told you aesthetics are important to me. The way properties look are important to me. So I was not really very inclined to give them permission to change the exterior because they had the interior. But I finally decided that I would allow them to do it if they were able to replicate the appearance of the brick where they wanted to create a new opening. We had to put brick back. And I'll never forget, I drove out to this property and I saw what they had done, and they had represented and agreed in writing, and I think Mr. Glazer may have been involved in the legal document because I trust him and I know he's going to look out for me. And I saw the fascia of the brick. It didn't match at all. They didn't care. They were going to just try to do whatever they could do and not necessarily spend the money to make it look the way it was because that's what they wanted to do. And I held their feet to the fire, and I had to bring in an artist to paint the brick, to make the new brick match the old brick. And Giant ended up paying for it because they had agreed to do it in the first place, but they didn't want to take the time or spend the money to do it. So the only comment I would make to you is, good luck with Giant. They are challenging, they are difficult, and they have their own idea about how the world turns, and I think they do themselves a disservice by not engaging in the local community more and in a more complementary fashion and in a less adversarial way. That would be my comment.
Sam, about the aesthetics, didn't you tell me once that you drove into one of your shopping centers and you saw a sign that was a little bit askew, and you got on the manager and made him fix it?
Since Bill's asking me questions, and I can give you some anecdotes which are kind of fun. So, I drive around and I look at my properties regularly. So even though there's a property manager, and even though there's a management company, my dad had a saying, and I found it to be very true. You get what you inspect, not what you expect. And even though the company, the property management company, knows what they're supposed to do, knows how I want things done, sometimes it's not done the way I want it done. And one of the things I do at my shopping centers is I will place a sign at the exit of the property on the drive lane out to get to the main road. and it says, "Thank you for shopping with us." I want to engage the consumer when they leave. I want to thank them for having come to the property. I try to make it attractive. I try to landscape around it. I try to do everything I can think to do to make the shopping experience for the consumer as positive and enjoyable and as fun as I can do. Outside of the stores, the tenant spaces, and underneath the canopy, I put in speakers so there's music playing. I try to do everything I can think of to make that experience for the consumer a better experience while they're there. So there's one particular property that I talked to Bill about, and I guess our sons were at a sporting event, and I was commiserating with them because I was so upset that some car had driven over my "Thank you for shopping with us" sign. So now I had to get it put in. Some driver was drunk, ran over the sign, and I don't like that when that happens in my properties. That makes me upset. So I asked the property manager to contact the sign company, get the sign rebuilt, put it back in the same location at the same height that it was before. And there's another "Thank you for shopping with us" sign at another exit. So all the property manager had to do was replicate the height of the sign. So it's raining and it's on a Tuesday morning, and I decide to drive out to this particular shopping center, and I see the "Thank you for shopping with us" sign. It's high up in the air. It's not where it's supposed to be. So I called the property manager, and I said, "Remember we talked about trying to put the sign back where it was, the same height, the same place?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I'm at the center, and that's not what happened." She said, "Oh, yes, it's the same height. It's the same height as the other sign." I said, "I'll tell you what, why don't you come over to the shopping center?" So she was in the neighborhood. She wasn't far away. She came over. I had an umbrella in my car. And we got out and we walked over to the sign that hadn't been damaged, and I put the tip of the umbrella in the dirt where the landscape was, and then put my finger around the umbrella where the bottom of the sign came. So I said, "See that?" She said, "Yes." So then we went over to the other sign. The other sign was 6 inches higher than where my finger was. I said to her, I said, "Do me a favor. Please try to do what I ask you to do. Please try to do it the way I ask you to do it. If you don't pay attention to your properties, no matter how good the people are that you work with, you will not get what you expect." Okay?
Did you say please?
I always say please, and I always say thank you. Yes?
Kind of talked about the transactions getting into the retail and the shopping centers, but I'm interested to see what kind of trouble, I guess, you've had, or some of the more interesting things that have happened during the operational side of the retail. Has it anything funny, whether it's funny, whether it's the biggest challenge you've been faced with tenants exiting the market and backfilling co-tenancy issues?
Okay, I'll tell you an interesting story. At least I hope you'll find it interesting. So in another property that my brother and I actually are partners in, because after he was willing to agree with me to be a partner in one property, he decided that he was willing to do a second property. And there was a Potomac Video tenant on a pad site. And the pad was about 2,800 square feet. And Potomac Video was not Blockbuster. It was just about gone by the wayside. And it wasn't Hollywood Video, which has disappeared. But they evidently were selling enough videos to pay the rent for a period of time. One of the things I've learned about the state of Virginia is the state of Virginia is friendly to landlords. If a tenant doesn't pay their rent in a timely fashion in Virginia, the state of Virginia is sympathetic to the landlord and is willing to help the landlord get control of the space. So my brother is a great partner, but he wants a return. And in this particular property, he put up the bulk of the money. So I felt very much responsible for making this property perform. And Hollywood Video started not paying its rent and started being delinquent. So I think back to Woodmont Corner, 2-story retail, rezone, get a higher density, create more value. Well, back a number of years ago, let's say 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, before we found ourselves in the financial conundrum that we find ourselves today with the financial marketplace, banks were falling all over themselves to find more branches. And they would just pay more for the next location than the competitor just to get the branch. I'm not sure why they were willing to do it, but it was music to my ears. I realized that I could get control of this Potomac Video pad site, evict the tenant because they weren't paying the rent anyway, and have a pad site that could get approved for a drive-through with a bank. Potomac Video was paying about $80,000 a year. The banks were willing to pay over $300,000 a year. The management company, Mr. Rappaport, my friend, the gentleman that allowed me to become his partner in Penmar, very smart man, very decent man. He has lots of different income-producing aspects to his business. One of them is he represents tenants. He brokers deals for them. And PNC was a tenant that was being represented by the Rappaport company. So they came to me and they said, we want an exclusive to rent this pad site where the Potomac Video was, and don't talk to SunTrust, and don't talk to Wells Fargo, and don't talk to Capital One. Do the deal with us. And I said, why should I do that? Why should I not go out to the market and find out what the market... Oh, well, we'll pay you a big number. All right, so we negotiated a lease where they agreed to pay $325,000 a year for 5 years. And then I think it went up to $375,000 a year for the next 5 years. And then, if they wanted to stay, it escalated from there. Good transaction, right? So, in order to change the use in Virginia, in Fairfax County, from one type of use, Potomac Video, to another type of use, a bank, you have to get special exception from Fairfax County. You have to go apply to them. You have to explain to them all the reasons why this is good and why they should approve it. It takes at least 9 months to get a special exception. At least. And you don't necessarily get it. Because if they decide for some reason they don't like it, or the residents in the community where the shopping center is decide they don't want it and they want to be called NIMBY, not in my backyard, you might not get it. So in the lease negotiations with PNC, and I've got a responsible partner that I have to take care of, I insisted that the day the special exception was obtained, the lease became valid and binding. They then were required to build their pad building for the bank within a certain period of time. They were required to pay rent, whether or not they started. And lo and behold, PNC sold one of their subsidiaries for an enormous profit, I think a couple $2 billion. And somebody in the management of the PNC system decided that the location that they had agreed to lease for my brother and I was too close to another location, and therefore they didn't want to build it. I worked hard to go from $80,000 to $325,000. And for those of you that are familiar, when you go to place a loan on a piece of income-producing real estate, the lender wants to know what's your income stream. And when they finance the debt that you want to borrow from them, the money they lend you, that income stream is crucial to the amount of money they lend you, the rate that you pay, the terms, and so forth and so on. So I've got a valid binding lease with PNC. They're obligated to pay me $325,000 a year, but now they said they don't want to build their branch anymore. So I called up my brother and I said, well, what do you think we should do? And he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to hold their feet to the fire. So first they offered us, and again, we got 10 years at 3 1/4, that's like $3.25 million over 10 years, as opposed to 800,000 over 10 years, or $1 million. So they came to us and they offered us, I think, $1 million to buy out the lease. And I called my brother and I said, okay, what do you want to do? He said, what do you want to do? I said, that's not enough. And the more I thought about it, the more I got upset, because their decision to not build that bank branch was not only going to adversely affect the income stream because they weren't going to pay it to us, but when the loan on the property came due, instead of having a tenant paying $325,000 or $350,000, we were going to get something that was less, because banks could and still can afford to pay more rent than most other tenants, because they're in the business of making money. That's how they service their shareholders and how they do what they do. Ultimately, because their transaction became time sensitive, it was getting to be the end of the year, and they had this sale of one of their subsidiaries for this enormous profit, they could afford to write off $3.5 million. So they paid us the $3.5 million, and we replaced them with Chipotle. Had to go back and get a special exception, because now we had a bank, now we got a restaurant. I think Chipotle is very good at what they do. I think they're reasonably priced. I think the food is fresh. I have to watch my waistline when I go there, but it's a good tenant, and people like to go to Chipotle. Chipotle is only paying us $125. So I'm not going to cry that we went from 80 to 125, and I'm not going to cry that we were able to hold PNC's feet to the fire and basically fulfill their lease obligation. But at the end, we still do not have that income stream that would have supported more debt. I don't know if that's a problem. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but that was kind of an interesting situation. And if I hadn't been willing to kind of stand up and really make them perform, then I think it would have turned out a lot differently. And I think what happens in real estate and many other businesses, you get tested. You get challenged. They want to see, where your bend and break point is. And if you think you're on firm ground and you think you're in a position to be able to do what you think is right, hold your ground. Other questions? Sir.